Yahweh was originally a war god. That is the general academic consensus concerning the nature of the national God of Israel, who became the monotheistic God of the Bible and of all Abrahamic religions. But if Yahweh was originally a war god, how did this war god become the God of the cosmos? As we explored in a previous episode concerning the origins and the triumph of Yahweh, we looked at the war god thesis. Now we are turning to the shifting understanding of Yahweh as time progressed in the kingdom of Judah. It was in the kingdom of Judah that Yahweh began to shed his warrior attributes and took on solar cosmic characteristics, likely during the 9th and the 8th centuries. The movement of Yahweh toward solar cosmic deity is also testified in the Hebrew language, the meaning of words, as well as archaeological iconography. Therefore, anyone telling you that Yahweh as a cosmic and solar deity has its origins in Zoroastrianism doesn't know what they are talking about. We know from linguistic etymology and archaeological iconography and discovery that the conceptualization of Yahweh as a solar and cosmic deity occurs many centuries before the Babylonian exile and any contact with Persian Zoroastrian religion. Various Hebrew names associated within the Judahite narrative of the Old Testament prior to the Babylonian exile mean light, shine, lamp, sun, etc., all implying cosmic and solar notions and conceptualizations. For instance, Uriah in Hebrew means flame of Yahweh, or Yahweh is my flame. And that most famous biblical character, Uriah, who is part of the Davidic narrative, is chronologically long before any Babylonian exile and possible contact with Zoroastrian religion. The priest Neriah, that name also means lamp of Yahweh. Again, an etymology implying cosmic solar conceptualizations. Sometime during the compilation of the Deuteronomic history, in which the Judahite narrative is composed, names begin to take on a significance indicating Yahweh as a figure of celestial light. Some of the Psalms, too, invoke light and radiance, that imagery of Yahweh as the sun, and those Psalms are all dated before the Babylonian exile. Furthermore, the inclusion of the epithet Sabaoth means celestial or heavenly army and armies. Thus you can also see the traditional roots of Yahweh as a war god still carried over into what we call the Sabbath. While this retains that divine warrior inheritance, what is important here in the association of a name meaning army of heaven or celestial army reveals that movement towards a celestialization, a cosmic conceptualization of Yahweh. Yahweh Sabaoth literally means God of the heavenly armies. Thus, we see cosmic wrestling and the notion and conceptualization of a cosmic deity within the formation and the evolution of the biblical conceptualization of God. There are two prevailing camps regarding the movement toward a celestial understanding of Yahweh, chiefly centered on this language of light and cosmos. The first is the recognition of the Egyptian and Assyrian influences over Judah. Judah, despite the pretensions of the biblical narrative, was often a vassal of other Near Eastern powers, even during its independence. The change of Yahweh toward solar, cosmic, and celestial language and imagery occurs during a time of Egyptian vassalage, and is therefore part of Egyptian influences in the temple cult and the understanding of Yahweh, part of the conflict between Josiah and Egypt in the biblical text is because Judah is an Egyptian vassal. Or alternatively, we also see the influence of Assyria over Israel and Judah because there were times when Israel and Judah were vassals of Assyria. And we also know from the biblical texts, as well as Assyrian archaeology, that the Assyrians eventually wiped Israel, the northern kingdom, off the face of the map, and that they waged war against the kingdom of Judah. Various archaeological discoveries, dated to the 8th and 7th century in Judah, reveal iconography that is reminiscent of the astral, solar, and celestial iconography of Egypt and Assyria. The other school of argument is that as Judah cemented itself and became peaceful, though it was often threatened by its larger imperial neighbors, the war god imagery and language begins to lose its potency. Again, if you go back to the lecture in which we dealt with Yahweh as a war god, we examined how the origins and the formation of the kingdom of Israel and Judah was through war. Thus, war god language and war god imagery makes more sense to that origin story of how the kingdom of Judah in particular came to be. But now, with that inheritance gone, and with a relative high amount of peace and prosperity occurring within Israel, Judah, that relative stability and peace which continued to develop within the kingdom led to a new understanding of Yahweh, God of the heavens, which fits with Judah's new sense of itself as the center of the world in the midst of a sea of turbulence. And this would also explain some of the cosmic chaos conf language, where Yahweh beats back Leviathan and the sea monsters and protects Judah, etc. This school doesn't preclude the possibility of influence from Near Eastern neighbors, but offers a more fluid thesis of celestial imagery and language rooted in expanding Judean theological consciousness that may well have drawn from the periphery neighborly ideas and imageries, but was ultimately the product of an internal development. A more peripheral school of internet scholarship, so to speak, which isn't academically accepted, is that the cosmic and celestial language are all late editions of the post-exilic period. But again, as we stated at the beginning of this lecture, those who make this argument do so out of ignorance, or they have a particular axe to grind against the Jewish religion in particular, which smacks of implicit anti-Semitism. We know from archaeological discoveries and linguistic etymological terminology that these celestial and solar conceptualizations of Yahweh were all occurring and are testified before any possible contact with Persian influence. The more accepted mainstream school of scholarship regarding the influence of Zoroastrian themes in Judaism and the continued evolution of Jewish theology is that these existing cosmic, solar, and celestial theological themes are given further consideration and strength through contact with Persian and Zoroastrian influences. For example, this argument asserts that from what we know from archaeology, language, and etymology, that as the Jews in Babylon and the Persian Empire already had a solar and celestial understanding of Yahweh, their contact with Zoroastrian religion, which also shares celestial theology, led to a strengthening of the notion of Yahweh as a cosmic deity. It is very probable then that the movement of Yahweh to celestial deity is a combination of all of these positions, that there was some influence of Egypt and Assyria as they exerted their power and force over Israel and Judah, which led to some internal developments of Yahwistic theology. We also have the reality that as Judah began to develop a relatively peaceful and prosperous economy on its own, this led to a new understanding of Yahweh, since the war god no longer carried prominence and pertinence to a relatively peaceful, stable, and prosperous kingdom of Judah, and that after the Babylonian exile, Jews who returned to Jerusalem, who already had a notion of cosmic and celestial understandings of Yahweh, had that notion strengthened by their contact with Persian and Zoroastrian religion. If Yahweh as war god cemented Yahweh as the national god of Israel and Judah, then the relative peace and stability of Judah before the exile likely led to a shift in consciousness away from war and toward cosmic conceptualizations. Furthermore, the failure of Sennacherib's invasion of Jerusalem likely influenced further development of Yahweh as the cosmic governor and deity exerting control over the world and other dark forces and spirits. Even though Sennacherib's Assyrian invasion devastated much of Judah, the fact that Jerusalem was spared was one of the central events of historical Judah. The salvation of Jerusalem led to a developed Jerusalem-centric theology prior to the exilic period, in which Yahweh began to be understood as the governor of the entire cosmos. In sum, then, the evolution away from a strict war god was likely the result of the circumstances of history and the expansion of Judahite consciousness during a century or multiple centuries of relative peace and stability and prosperity. If the early history of Israel-Judah is saturated in war, the middle history of Judah, in which the language and imagery of Yahweh takes on celestial characteristics, contra Israel, the northern kingdom, which is still busy fighting wars, was one of relative calm and peace, considerations of metaphysical things, the cosmos, which permitted greater contact as well with its neighbors, Egypt and Assyria, and the contemplative thought that resulted in these centuries of relative peace, prosperity, and stability turned Judahite theology away from war and toward heavenly matters. This celestial turn was subsequently reinforced by the post-exilic period, in which a grieving diaspora community, seeking to make sense of things, the terrible things that happened, drew on the existing celestial understanding of Yahweh and entrenched it in the lamentations and the desires for restoration, which are filled with all the rich language of God of heaven, God of the universe, etc. It is also important to state that for most historical critical scholars, there is only a minimal Zoroastrian influence, since the celestial imagery and language of Yahweh as a cosmic deity are already part of the Jewish tradition prior to the exile, though through the rubbing with Persian and Zoroastrian influences, there would have likely been a reinforcement of the conceptualization of celestial comfort found during the exilic period and reflected in the exilic literature. After the exile, pre-exilic celestial language married the exilic and post-exilic celestial language to form the contemporary view of Yahweh as God of the universe, Lord of all, Master of the world. In time, specifically as the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, which produced the Septuagint, which was the de facto scripture of early Christianity prior to the Reformation, the celestial language and understanding of Yahweh then took on universal prominence within the Greek translation of the Bible, and then spread to the world with the expansion of Christianity.